I'm Zara Williams, 34 years old, and everything changed when I walked into Westfield Premium Department Store on what was supposed to be a routine Saturday afternoon shopping trip with my children. What the store manager didn't know as he began following me around like I was some common criminal was that I was actually there to evaluate his performance as a senior mystery shopper for Retail Watch Corporate, and his behavior was about to cost him everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me as I share how a racist manager's assumptions led to the most satisfying workplace justice I've ever witnessed. Growing up as a black girl in suburban Minneapolis meant learning early that certain spaces weren't truly meant for you, no matter how much money your parents had or how well you dressed. My mother, Dr. Patricia Williams, was a successful pediatrician who could afford to shop anywhere she wanted, but she always prepared me for the reality of walking into upscale stores. Keep your hands visible, don't touch anything unless you're serious about buying it, and always keep your receipts, she'd tell me before every shopping trip. The warnings felt excessive when I was 8 years old, but by the time I was 12 and experiencing my first real incident of being followed through a jewelry store while shopping for my grandmother's birthday gift, I understood why the preparation was necessary. The pattern continued through high school and college. Store employees who smiled warmly at my white classmates would suddenly become hyper-attentive when I browsed the same racks. Security guards would materialize near whatever section I was shopping in, pretending to organize displays while keeping me in their peripheral vision. Sales associates would hover just close enough to monitor my movements while maintaining plausible deniability about their surveillance. Each incident was small enough to question whether it was really happening, but consistent enough to create a constant low-level anxiety whenever I entered retail spaces. By the time I graduated from Northwestern with my MBA in retail management, I'd experienced enough of these encounters to recognize the systemic nature of retail racial profiling. My senior thesis focused on the economic impact of discriminatory customer service practices, documenting how stores lost revenue by alienating customers of color through suspicious treatment. The research caught the attention of Retail Watch Corporate, a consulting firm that specialized in mystery shopping evaluations for major retail chains. They recruited me, specifically because my lived experience gave me insights that traditional mystery shoppers missed. For the past 6 years, I'd built a reputation as one of their most thorough evaluators, known for catching subtle forms of discrimination that other mystery shoppers overlooked. My evaluations had led to policy changes, employee retraining programs, and in several cases, the termination of managers whose biases created hostile environments for customers of color. The work felt meaningful, like I was using my painful experiences to prevent other people from enduring the same humiliation I'd faced throughout my life. My children, Kai and Sage, had grown up hearing sanitized versions of these stories. At 8 years old, Kai was beginning to understand that some adults treated people differently because of skin color, though I tried to shield him from the worst examples. 6-year-old Sage was still innocent enough to believe that all adults were basically fair and kind. I dreaded the day when they would experience their first real incident of racial profiling, knowing it would shatter something precious in their understanding of the world. The assignment at Westfield Premium Department Store was supposed to be routine. Corporate had received complaints about discriminatory treatment from several black customers, and they wanted an evaluation of the store's customer service practices, particularly regarding racial bias. The store manager, Derek Ashworth, had been flagged in previous complaints for what customers described as aggressive surveillance and unwelcoming behavior toward people of color. My job was to document his interactions with customers, evaluate staff training regarding inclusive service, and provide recommendations for improvement. I'd spent the morning reviewing Derek's employment file and the specific complaints against him. Multiple customers had reported being followed, questioned about their ability to afford merchandise, and subjected to unnecessary security checks. One incident involved a black family being asked to leave their bags at customer service for security purposes, while white customers carried similar bags throughout the store without question. Another complaint described Derek personally approaching a young black woman and suggesting she might be more comfortable shopping at a different store with more accessible price points. The evaluation criteria were specific. I needed to observe Derek's behavior during peak shopping hours, document any disparities in customer treatment, and assess whether his management style created an inclusive environment for all customers. Corporate was particularly interested in whether he would demonstrate the same suspicious behavior toward me that had been reported by other black customers. If the complaints were accurate, my assignment was to gather sufficient evidence for disciplinary action, potentially including termination. What I hadn't anticipated was bringing my children along that day. My usual Saturday babysitter had canceled last minute due to illness, and my ex-husband Marcus was out of town for work. Kai and Sage were well-behaved kids who had accompanied me on shopping trips before, though never during a professional evaluation. I thought their presence might actually help my cover, making me appear more like a genuine customer rather than someone conducting surveillance. As we approached the gleaming entrance of Westfield Premium Department Store that Saturday afternoon, I reminded the kids about store behavior and checked that my hidden camera was properly positioned in my purse. I had no idea that the next few hours would be the most humiliating and ultimately satisfying experience of my professional career. The moment we stepped through the glass doors of Westfield Premium Department Store, I felt the familiar weight of unwelcome attention. Derek Ashworth was stationed near the customer service counter, a tall white man in his early 40s with perfectly styled hair and the kind of aggressive smile that never reached his eyes. He looked up from his clipboard the instant we entered, his gaze immediately locking onto us with an intensity that made my stomach clench. I'd experienced this type of scrutiny countless times before, but having my children witness it added a layer of dread I wasn't prepared for. "Good afternoon," Derek called out, approaching us with purposeful strides that were too quick to be casual. "Welcome to Westfield Premium. Is there anything specific I can help you find today?" His tone was polite enough, but there was something performative about it, like he was establishing his presence rather than offering genuine assistance. Kai looked up at him with the open curiosity of childhood, while Sage instinctively moved closer to my side, sensing the tension I was trying to hide. "We're just browsing, thank you," I replied with the practiced pleasantness I'd perfected over years of retail interactions. Derek nodded, but instead of returning to his post, he lingered nearby, pretending to straighten a display of handbags while keeping us in his peripheral vision. I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app, beginning to document the interaction. 12:15 p.m., Manager Derek Ashworth approached immediately upon entry, offered assistance but remained in area after a polite decline. As we moved toward the women's clothing section, Derek's presence became more obvious. He followed at a distance that maintained plausible deniability, always appearing to have legitimate business in whatever area we browsed. When I stopped to examine a rack of blouses, he materialized at a nearby display, adjusting price tags with unnecessary attention to detail. When the kids wandered toward the children's section, he radioed something into his walkie-talkie that I couldn't quite hear, but the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. "Mommy, why is that man following us?" Sage whispered, tugging on my jacket. Her question was loud enough for Derek to hear, and I watched his jaw tighten slightly before he forced his smile wider. "He's not following us, sweetheart," I said quietly, though my heart was racing. "He's just doing his job." It was a lie we both knew wasn't true, but I wasn't ready to explain racial profiling to my 6-year-old daughter in the middle of a department store. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Hidden in my purse was my Retail Watch corporate identification badge and the official evaluation forms that Derek would eventually need to sign. My briefcase contained detailed instructions about assessing his management style, his treatment of diverse customers, and his adherence to corporate anti-discrimination policies. I was literally there to evaluate whether he engaged in the exact behavior he was currently demonstrating, and he had no idea that every moment of his surveillance was being documented for his supervisors. My phone buzzed with a text from my supervisor at Retail Watch. "How's the Westfield evaluation going? Need preliminary findings by Monday for the corporate review meeting." I typed back quickly. "Still in progress. Significant observations already documented." What I didn't mention was that Derek was providing more evidence of discriminatory behavior in 20 minutes than I usually gathered in hours of observation. Derek's tactics became more sophisticated as we continued shopping. When I picked up a designer jacket to examine the price tag, he appeared beside me with unnecessary helpfulness. "That's a beautiful piece," he said, his voice carrying a subtle condescension. "It's part of our premium collection. The price point reflects the exceptional quality." He emphasized premium and price point in a way that suggested he doubted my ability to afford the merchandise, though he was careful to maintain professional language that would be difficult to challenge directly. "I can see the price tag," I replied evenly, continuing to examine the jacket. Derek's smile faltered slightly, and I watched him reassess his approach. "Of course," he said. "I just like to make sure our customers understand the value they're getting. We have some beautiful options in our contemporary collection as well if you'd like to see pieces at different price points." The suggestion was delivered with practiced politeness, but the implication was clear. Perhaps I should consider shopping in a section more suited to my presumed budget. Kai had been unusually quiet during these exchanges, and I realized he was picking up on the undercurrents of the conversation in ways that broke my heart. At 8 years old, he was smart enough to understand that something was wrong with how this man was treating his mother, but too young to process the racial dynamics at play. When Derek made another comment about appropriate price ranges, Kai stepped closer to me with a protective instinct that no child should need to develop. The hidden camera in my purse was capturing everything. but I also needed to document the evaluation criteria in real time. Derek's behavior clearly violated multiple corporate policies regarding customer service and non-discriminatory treatment. His assumptions about my purchasing power based on my appearance, his persistent surveillance, and his condescending suggestions about appropriate merchandise all constituted textbook examples of racial profiling in retail settings. 20 minutes into our shopping trip, Derek's behavior escalated to a new level. As I browsed through a rack of evening dresses, he approached with two security guards in tow, both of whom looked uncomfortable with whatever instructions they'd been given. "Ma'am," Derek said, his professional mask slipping slightly to reveal the suspicion underneath. "I've noticed you and your children have been browsing for quite some time without making any purchases. Is there something specific you're looking for that we can help you locate?" The question was phrased as helpful customer service, but delivered in front of security guards, it carried an unmistakable threat. Other customers in the area began to notice the commotion, some stopping their own shopping to observe what was clearly becoming a confrontational situation. I felt the familiar surge of humiliation and anger that came with being publicly questioned about my right to exist in a retail space. But underneath it was something new, the professional satisfaction of watching Derek provide undeniable evidence of the discriminatory behavior that would soon cost him his job. "We're shopping," I said simply, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Is there a time limit on browsing that I should be aware of?" Derek's face flushed slightly at the direct challenge, and I saw him glance toward the security guards as if seeking support for his next move. What he didn't know was that every word of this interaction was being documented for the corporate review that would determine his future employment. Derek's eyes narrowed at my direct question about browsing time limits, and I watched him recalibrate his approach with the practiced skill of someone who had navigated these confrontations before. "Of course there's no time limit," he said, forcing his professional smile back into place. "We just want to ensure all our customers have the best possible shopping experience. Sometimes families with young children find it helpful to have a more focused approach to their visit." The suggestion was delivered with manufactured concern, but the security guards flanking him made his real message clear. Sage pressed against my leg, her small hand gripping my jacket as she sensed the adults around us growing tense. Other shoppers were beginning to slow their browsing, stealing glances at our group with the uncomfortable fascination that accompanied public confrontations. I could feel their whispered speculations, the assumptions forming in real time about why a black woman and her children warranted security attention in an upscale department store. The familiar shame of being made into a spectacle washed over me, even as I mentally documented every detail for my evaluation report. "Mom, I want to go home," Kai whispered, his 8-year-old voice carrying a tremor that made my chest tighten. He'd been quiet during our browsing, absorbing the uncomfortable dynamics with the perception that children develop when they're forced to mature too quickly. Now he was looking up at the security guards with the kind of wariness that no child should need to learn, and I realized this experience was becoming exactly the type of racial profiling introduction I'd hoped to shield him from for a few more years. Derek must have sensed my hesitation because he pressed his advantage, stepping slightly closer with renewed confidence. "Perhaps I could personally assist you in finding something specific," he offered, his tone becoming more paternalistic. "We have a wonderful selection in our contemporary department, and I'd be happy to show you some pieces that might be more aligned with your shopping goals today." His word choice was carefully calculated to maintain professional deniability, while making his assumptions about my economic status increasingly obvious. One of the security guards, a middle-aged black man whose name tag read Marcus Rivera, caught my eye briefly. I saw something in his expression that looked like recognition, not of my face, but of my situation. He'd probably witnessed Derek orchestrate similar scenarios before, forced to participate in confrontations that made him uncomfortable but threatened his employment if he refused. The complexity of his position wasn't lost on me. Here was another person of color being used to legitimize Derek's discriminatory behavior. "I'm perfectly capable of browsing on my own," I replied, maintaining the even tone that had served me well in countless professional situations. "But thank you for your concern." Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at my refusal to accept his suggested limitations. I could see him calculating his next move, weighing how far he could push without crossing lines that would be too obvious to defend later. The irony of the situation was becoming almost surreal. In my purse was a detailed evaluation form that specifically assessed managers' adherence to inclusive customer service practices. One section asked me to rate Derek's respectful treatment of all customers, regardless of race, ethnicity, or perceived economic status. Another required documentation of any incidents where customers were subjected to unnecessary surveillance or questioning based on demographic assumptions. Derek was systematically failing every criterion while providing me with textbook examples of retail discrimination. My phone buzzed again with another message from my retail watch supervisor. Corporate is particularly interested in this store due to recent complaints. Make sure you get comprehensive documentation of management practices. I quickly typed back, abundant evidence being collected. Situation developing in real time. What I couldn't explain in a brief text was that Derek was exceeding even my worst expectations for discriminatory behavior. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you to accompany me to customer service," Derek announced, his voice carrying a new authority that suggested he'd made some internal decision about how to handle our presence. "We've had some issues with inventory management today, and I need to verify a few things." The request was vague enough to maintain plausible deniability, but specific enough to sound official to the growing audience of other customers. The absurdity of being asked to report to customer service by the very person I was there to evaluate created a moment of cognitive dissonance that I struggled to process. Derek had no idea that he was essentially asking his corporate evaluator to submit to interrogation based on racial profiling. The hidden camera in my purse was capturing every moment of this interaction, creating the kind of undeniable evidence that would make my final report impossible for corporate to ignore. "I haven't done anything that requires verification," I said clearly, my voice carrying enough volume for nearby customers to hear. Several people had stopped pretending to shop and were openly watching our exchange now, some pulling out their phones to record what was obviously becoming a confrontational situation. Derek glanced around nervously at the gathering attention, but seemed committed to his chosen course of action. "It's just a routine matter," he insisted, though his body language suggested anything but routine. "We appreciate your cooperation in helping us maintain a secure shopping environment for all our customers." The language was corporate speak designed to make his request sound reasonable, but delivered in front of security guards, it carried an unmistakable undertone of threat. Sarah Chen, a young Asian woman with a Westfield name tag, approached our group with obvious discomfort. "Mr. Ashworth," she said quietly, "is everything all right here? These customers look like they might need some assistance." Her intervention was subtle but clearly intended to de-escalate the situation, and I caught Derek shooting her an irritated look that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd questioned his treatment of customers. "Everything's fine, Sarah," Derek replied curtly. "I'm handling this situation." But Sarah didn't retreat as he'd obviously expected. Instead, she turned to me with genuine concern in her voice. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry if there's been any confusion. Is there anything I can help you find today? We just got in some beautiful new arrivals that might interest you." Her offer was delivered with the kind of authentic customer service that made Derek's behavior even more obviously discriminatory by contrast. For a moment, I considered revealing my corporate identification and ending this charade immediately. The temptation to watch Derek's face change when he realized I was his evaluator was almost overwhelming, but my professional training reminded me that maintaining my cover was essential for a complete assessment. I needed to see how far he would go, how extensively he would violate corporate policies when he thought no one was watching. "Thank you, Sarah," I said, accepting her genuine offer of assistance. "We're just browsing today, but I appreciate your help." Derek's frustration with Sarah's intervention was becoming visible, and I realized I was witnessing not just his treatment of customers, but his management style with employees who challenged his discriminatory practices. Both observations would be crucial elements of my final evaluation report. The tension in Derek's voice when he addressed Sarah made it clear that her intervention wasn't welcome, and I watched him struggle to maintain his professional facade while reasserting control over the situation. "Sarah, why don't you return to your section?" he said with forced politeness that barely concealed his irritation. "I can handle our customers' needs from here." The dismissal was sharp enough that several nearby shoppers glanced over, and I saw Sarah's face flush with embarrassment as she reluctantly stepped back. Sage tugged on my jacket again, this time more insistently. "Mommy, I don't like this place," she whispered, her 6-year-old voice carrying the kind of distress that made my maternal instincts override my professional obligations. "Can we go somewhere else?" Her question was loud enough for Derek to hear, and I watched his expression shift to something that looked almost satisfied, as if her discomfort validated his approach to making us feel unwelcome. "We can leave whenever you want, sweetheart," I told her softly, though the words felt like admitting defeat. Derek had successfully created an environment so hostile that my children were uncomfortable, which was exactly the outcome his behavior was designed to achieve. The fact that I was documenting everything for corporate didn't diminish the immediate reality that my kids were experiencing their first real encounter with racial discrimination. And it was happening because I'd brought them into this situation. Kai had been watching the adult interactions with the intensity of a child trying to decode complicated social dynamics. Now, he stepped forward with the kind of protective instinct that broke my heart. "You're being mean to my mom," he said to Derek, his 8-year-old voice carrying more courage than many adults would show in similar circumstances. "She didn't do anything wrong." The simple directness of his observation seemed to catch Derek off guard, and I saw him glance around nervously at the other customers who were clearly listening to every word. "Son, I'm just doing my job," Derek replied, crouching down to Kai's eye level in a gesture that was probably meant to appear paternal, but came across as condescending. Sometimes grown-ups have to handle business matters that kids don't understand. His explanation was delivered with a kind of false kindness that made my skin crawl, especially directed at my child who was defending me from treatment that Derek would never subject a white family to. The absurdity of explaining racial profiling to Derek while maintaining my cover as a customer, rather than revealing my identity as his corporate evaluator, created a cognitive dissonance that was becoming harder to manage. Every instinct told me to end this charade by showing him my retail watch identification and watching his confident demeanor crumble. But my professional training reminded me that premature revelation would compromise the evaluation and potentially allow Derek to claim his behavior was somehow justified by special circumstances. My phone buzzed with a text from my ex-husband Marcus, who was checking in from his business trip. "How's your day with the kids going?" The innocent question highlighted the gap between my planned family outing and the discriminatory nightmare we were actually experiencing. I couldn't explain in a text that we were trapped in a situation where I had to endure racial profiling for professional reasons, while my children witnessed their mother being treated like a suspected criminal. Derek's radio crackled with an incoming message, and he stepped aside to respond while keeping us within his line of sight. I caught fragments of his conversation: suspicious behavior, extended browsing, and keeping an eye on the situation. The language he used with his security team was more explicit than his careful public statements, and I realized my hidden camera was capturing evidence of the kind of coded communication that retail discrimination training specifically warned against. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to ask you and your children to come with me to the office," Derek announced when he finished his radio conversation. His tone had shifted from false politeness to barely concealed authority, and the security guards moved slightly closer as if prepared to enforce his request. "We need to resolve some concerns about your visit today." The vague language was designed to sound official while avoiding specific accusations that could be challenged later. The moment felt like a breaking point where I had to choose between protecting my children from further humiliation and completing my professional evaluation. The maternal part of me wanted to grab Kai and Sage and leave immediately, ending their exposure to this toxic situation. But the professional part of me recognized that Derek was providing unprecedented documentation of retail discrimination, the kind of evidence that could prevent other families from experiencing similar treatment. "What concerns?" I asked clearly, my voice carrying enough volume for other customers to hear. "We haven't violated any store policies or engaged in any suspicious behavior." Several people had their phones out now, obviously recording what was becoming a public confrontation, and Derek seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the attention his actions were generating. "It's a private matter that we can discuss in the office," Derek insisted, but his body language suggested he was beginning to realize that his approach was creating more problems than it solved. The growing audience of customers, some of whom were openly expressing disapproval of his treatment of our family, was clearly not the outcome he'd anticipated when he began his surveillance. Marcus Rivera, the security guard who had seemed uncomfortable earlier, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Ashworth, maybe we should," he began, but Derek cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I'll handle this, Marcus," Derek snapped, his professional mask slipping to reveal the irritation underneath. "Just follow my lead." The exchange revealed the hierarchical pressure that forced even sympathetic employees to participate in discriminatory practices. Sage started crying, overwhelmed by the tension and adult conflict she couldn't understand. "I want to go home," she sobbed, pressing her face against my leg. "Why is everyone being mean?" Her tears created a moment of clarity about what was really at stake here. My evaluation of Derek's management practices was important, but my children's emotional well-being was paramount, and I realized I was approaching the limit of what I could ask them to endure for professional purposes. "Sir, you're upsetting my children," I said to Derek, my voice carrying a mother's authority that transcended the customer-manager dynamic he'd been trying to establish. "They haven't done anything wrong, and neither have I. If you have specific concerns about our behavior, please state them clearly. Otherwise, we're going to continue shopping or leave as we choose." The directness of my challenge seemed to surprise him, and I saw him glance toward the security guards as if seeking support for his next move. What Derek didn't know was that his treatment of my children was being documented not just by my hidden camera, but by multiple customers who were recording the interaction with their phones. His discriminatory behavior was becoming a public spectacle that would be much harder for corporate to ignore or rationalize. The evidence I was gathering for my evaluation was now being supplemented by independent witnesses who could testify to the hostile environment he created for customers of color. The sound of Sage's continued crying and Kai's whispered attempts to comfort his sister created an emotional backdrop that made Derek's actions appear even more unreasonable to the growing audience. I realized this moment was becoming a crucial test of whether I could maintain my professional objectivity while protecting my children from further psychological harm. The sound of Sage's crying was drawing more attention from other shoppers, and I could see Derek's calculation shifting as he realized his actions were creating a public relations nightmare rather than the quiet resolution he'd probably envisioned. An elderly white woman approached our group with the kind of righteous indignation that suggested she'd witnessed enough of Derek's behavior to form her own conclusions about what was happening. "Excuse me, but what exactly is the problem here?" she asked Derek directly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "This young mother and her children have been shopping peacefully, and you've been harassing them for the past half hour. I've been watching this entire interaction, and it's absolutely disgraceful." Her intervention seemed to embolden other customers who had been observing quietly, and I could feel the mood in the store shifting against Derek's handling of the situation. Derek's face flushed as he found himself surrounded by disapproving customers, rather than the compliant audience he'd expected. "Ma'am, this is a private matter between store management and these customers," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "I appreciate your concern, but we have procedures we need to follow for everyone's safety." His explanation sounded increasingly hollow as more people gathered to witness what was obviously discriminatory treatment. My phone buzzed with another message from Retail Watch Corporate. "Need status update on Westfield evaluation. Timeline critical for Monday presentation." The irony of receiving evaluation deadlines while being subjected to the exact behavior I was hired to assess created a surreal moment of professional detachment. I typed back quickly, "Exceptional documentation in progress. Derek Ashworth providing comprehensive evidence of policy violations." Kai had stopped trying to comfort his sister and was now staring at Derek with the kind of direct, unblinking gaze that children use when they're trying to understand adult behavior that makes no sense. "Why don't you like us?" he asked with devastating simplicity. "We didn't do anything bad." His question cut through all of Derek's carefully constructed justifications and exposed the racial animus at the heart of his actions. Several customers audibly gasped at the child's innocent observation. The moment felt like a turning point, where I could end Derek's harassment by revealing my corporate identity. But something held me back. Part of it was professional training about maintaining evaluation integrity, but part of it was a deeper need to see how far Derek would go when he thought he could act with impunity. His behavior was already providing enough evidence to terminate him, but I found myself curious about whether he would escalate further or recognize that his approach was backfiring. "Son, this isn't personal," Derek told Kai, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that adults use when they're lying to children. "Sometimes, store managers have to make decisions that seem unfair, but we're just trying to keep everyone safe." The explanation was so transparently dishonest that several customers shook their heads in disgust, and I saw the elderly woman pull out her phone to start recording. Sarah Chen reappeared at the edge of our group, clearly torn between following Derek's directive to stay away and her obvious concern about how the situation was escalating. "Mr. Ashworth," she said quietly, "maybe we should step back and reassess. These customers haven't actually done anything that requires intervention." Her gentle challenge to his authority was delivered with the careful diplomacy of an employee who knew her job could be at risk for questioning management decisions. Derek turned on Sarah with visible irritation. "I told you to return to your section," he snapped, abandoning any pretense of professional courtesy. "This doesn't concern you." His harsh treatment of an employee who was trying to de-escalate the situation provided additional evidence of his problematic management style, and I made mental notes about his inability to accept feedback or consider alternative approaches to customer conflicts. The hidden camera in my purse was capturing everything, but I was also becoming aware that multiple customers were recording the interaction with their phones. Derek's discriminatory behavior was being documented from multiple angles by independent witnesses, creating the kind of comprehensive evidence that would be impossible for corporate to dismiss or rationalize. The evaluation I'd been hired to conduct was evolving into a public incident that would likely have consequences beyond Derek's individual employment. My corporate identification badge felt heavy in my purse. Like a loaded weapon, I could deploy to instantly reverse the power dynamic. The temptation to pull it out and watch Derek's confident demeanor crumble was almost overwhelming, especially as Sage continued crying and other customers expressed increasing outrage at his treatment of our family. but something deeper was driving my decision to maintain the charade a little longer. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time," I said to Derek, my voice carrying a calm authority that seemed to surprise him. "What specific store policy have we violated that justifies this treatment? What suspicious behavior have you observed that warrants security intervention?" My direct questions were designed to force him to articulate his accusations publicly, where other customers could evaluate the reasonableness of his claims. Derek glanced around at the growing crowd of witnesses, clearly realizing that his actions had created an audience he couldn't control. "Ma'am, I don't have to justify store security procedures to customers," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction he'd shown earlier. "If you have concerns about our policies, you can contact corporate customer service." The deflection was a classic retail management technique for avoiding accountability, but delivered in front of outraged witnesses, it sounded more like an admission of wrongdoing. "I want to speak to your supervisor," I announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. The request was standard customer service protocol, but it carried additional weight given the public nature of our confrontation. Derek's hesitation suggested he was beginning to realize that involving higher management might not work in his favor, especially with multiple customers recording evidence of his discriminatory behavior. "I am the store manager," Derek replied stiffly. "There's no one higher than me available right now." His response revealed something interesting about the store's management structure and suggested that he felt protected by his position from immediate consequences. What he didn't know was that my evaluation would go directly to corporate executives who had the authority to override any local management decisions about his employment. The crowd of watching customers was growing larger, and I could hear whispered conversations about calling corporate complaints lines and posting videos on social media. Derek's attempt to quietly remove a potentially problematic customer was transforming into a public relations disaster that would likely reach far beyond the store's immediate management. The documentation I was gathering for my professional evaluation was being supplemented by viral social media content that would be much harder for Retail Watch's corporate clients to ignore. Marcus Rivera approached Derek with obvious reluctance. "Sir, maybe we should consider letting this go," he suggested quietly. "It's creating a lot of attention, and the customers seem pretty upset about how this is being handled." His attempt to provide Derek with an exit strategy demonstrated the kind of practical wisdom that came from experience with similar situations. But Derek seems too invested in his chosen course to accept the offered escape route. "I'll decide how to handle this situation," Derek told Marcus curtly, his ego apparently overriding his judgment about the growing risks of continued confrontation. The exchange provided additional insight into his management style and his inability to accept input from subordinates, even when their advice might prevent further problems. I realized we had reached a crucial moment where Derek would either escalate his discriminatory behavior to an even more extreme level, or recognize that his approach had failed and retreat. Either outcome would provide valuable information for my evaluation, but the human cost to my children was becoming harder to justify for professional purposes. Derek's decision to double down rather than retreat became clear when he pulled out his walkie-talkie and called for additional security backup. "I need 2 more units to the women's department immediately," he announced, his voice carrying across the store with an authority that suggested he was prepared to escalate the situation to whatever level necessary to maintain his control. The crackle of radio responses confirmed that more security personnel were en route, and I realized Derek was committed to a course of action that would either vindicate his suspicions or expose him to career-ending liability. Sage's crying intensified at the sight of Derek's radio and the obvious implications of calling for reinforcements. "Mommy, are we in trouble?" she sobbed, clinging to my leg with the desperate grip of a child who sensed that adult authority figures had decided she and her family were threats. "Did we do something bad?" Her questions were heartbreaking in their innocence, and I struggled to find words that would comfort her without lying about the gravity of our situation. The arrival of 2 additional security guards created a semicircle of uniformed authority around our family that looked intimidating even to me, despite knowing that I had the corporate credentials to end this nightmare instantly. Other customers stepped back from the obvious confrontation, though many continued recording with their phones. The elderly woman who had initially defended us looked appalled at the escalation. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she announced loudly. "You're terrorizing a mother and her children for no reason whatsoever." "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and allow us to handle this situation," Derek told her with newly assertive confidence, emboldened by his security backup. "This is store business that doesn't concern other customers." His dismissal of a witness who had observed his entire discriminatory performance demonstrated either remarkable arrogance or complete ignorance about how public relations disasters develop in the social media age. Kai had gone completely silent, pressed against my other side with the kind of stillness that children adopt when they're trying to become invisible during adult conflicts. At 8 years old, he was old enough to understand that something was seriously wrong with how we were being treated, but too young to process the racial dynamics that made our family a target. I could see him looking around at the other customers and security guards, trying to understand why everyone was focused on us with such intensity. Derek's radio crackled again with an incoming message, and I caught the words inventory concerns and possible concealment in the transmission. The coded language suggested that he was now actively fabricating specific allegations rather than maintaining the vague suspicions he'd expressed earlier. My hidden camera was capturing every moment of this escalation, but I was also becoming aware that the situation was moving beyond simple discrimination into territory that could traumatize my children permanently. "Ma'am, we're going to need to search your bags and check your receipts for any items you've selected today," Derek announced with the kind of official authority that was clearly designed to sound like established store policy. The security guards moved slightly closer, creating a more obvious circle of containment around our family. "This is a routine security procedure that we apply to all customers when certain protocols are triggered." The absurdity of being accused of theft by the manager I was hired to evaluate created a moment of professional cognitive dissonance that was becoming harder to maintain. Derek was systematically violating every corporate policy regarding customer treatment, non-discriminatory service, and conflict de-escalation. His behavior was providing enough evidence to justify immediate termination, but he was also creating a traumatic experience for my children that no professional evaluation could justify. "What protocols?" I asked clearly, my voice carrying enough volume for the recording customers to hear. "What specific behavior have you observed that triggers bag searches? And do you apply these same protocols to all families or just to Black families?" My direct challenge to articulate his racial profiling seemed to catch Derek off guard, and I saw him glance nervously at the phones pointed in our direction. "This isn't about race," Derek insisted, but his defensive tone suggested he was beginning to realize that his actions looked exactly like racial discrimination to everyone watching. "We have security concerns that require verification, and we appreciate your cooperation in resolving them quickly." The corporate speak was designed to maintain professional deniability, but delivered in front of outraged witnesses, it sounded more like an attempt to rationalize obviously biased treatment. Sarah Chen appeared at the edge of the security circle, her face flushed with obvious distress about how the situation had escalated. "Mr. Ashworth, I really think we should reconsider this approach," she said, her voice carrying more urgency than her earlier interventions. "There are a lot of customers watching, and social media attention could be really problematic for the store." Her concern about public relations implications suggested she understood the broader consequences of Derek's actions better than he did. "Sarah, if you don't return to your section immediately, you'll be written up for insubordination," Derek snapped, his frustration with employee pushback becoming openly hostile. "I don't need input from sales associates about store security procedures." His harsh treatment of an employee who was trying to prevent a public relations disaster provided additional evidence of his problematic management style and inability to accept feedback from subordinates. One of the security guards, a young white man who looked uncomfortable with the entire situation, leaned toward Derek and whispered something I couldn't hear. Derek's response was sharp enough to be audible. "I don't care how it looks, we have procedures to follow." The exchange suggested that even his own security team was questioning the wisdom of continuing this confrontation. But Derek seemed too invested in his chosen course to consider alternative approaches. My phone buzzed with a text from my ex-husband. "Kids okay? Haven't heard from you today." The innocent check-in highlighted how far our simple shopping trip had devolved into a discriminatory nightmare that I would struggle to explain to anyone who hadn't witnessed it. I quickly typed back, "Call you later, dealing with the situation right now." The understatement felt inadequate, but I couldn't explain the complexity of being racially profiled while conducting a corporate evaluation in a brief text message. "I want to call my daddy," Sage announced through her tears, her 6-year-old voice cutting through the adult tensions with heartbreaking clarity. "I want to go home right now." Her distress was becoming a focal point for other customers' outrage, and I could hear whispered comments about calling Child Protective Services and contacting local news stations. Derek's actions were creating consequences that extended far beyond store management and corporate evaluations. The hidden camera in my purse was documenting everything, but I was also becoming aware that multiple customers were uploading their recordings to social media in real time. Derek's discriminatory behavior was becoming viral content that would reach audiences far beyond Retail Watch's corporate executives. The professional evaluation I'd been hired to conduct was evolving into a public relations catastrophe that would likely have industry-wide implications. Marcus Rivera approached Derek with obvious reluctance. "Sir, I really think we should step back from this," he said quietly. The optics are getting really bad, and we're creating more problems than we're solving. His attempt to provide Derek with an exit strategy was delivered with the diplomatic caution of someone who knew his job depended on management approval. But his concern was clearly genuine. "Marcus, you follow my orders, not the other way around," Derek replied curtly, his authority apparently taking precedence over practical wisdom about risk management. "If you're not comfortable with store security procedures, maybe you should consider whether this is the right job for you." The threat was delivered quietly, but several customers were close enough to hear it, and I saw phones turn toward Derek as people recorded his intimidation of employees who questioned his approach. I realized we had reached the point where Derek's behavior was so extreme that maintaining my cover was becoming secondary to protecting my children from further psychological damage. The evaluation evidence I'd gathered was already comprehensive enough to justify any disciplinary action corporate might consider. But the human cost of allowing this charade to continue was becoming unacceptable. The moment felt like a final test of whether Derek would recognize the catastrophic nature of his choices or continue escalating until someone intervened to stop him. Either outcome would provide the conclusion to my evaluation, but I was no longer sure the professional benefits justified the personal trauma we were enduring. The moment Derek reached for my purse to conduct his threatened search, something inside me shifted from professional evaluator to protective mother, and I realized the charade had gone far enough. "Before you do that," I said, my voice taking on an authority that made Derek pause mid-motion, "I think there's something you should know about who you've been harassing for the past hour." I reached into my purse, not for the receipts he demanded, but for the leather portfolio containing my Retail Watch corporate identification, and the evaluation forms that would determine his future employment. Derek's confident expression began to falter as I pulled out my official credentials, the gold corporate logo catching the store's fluorescent lighting. "My name is Zara Williams, and I'm a senior mystery shopper for Retail Watch Corporate," I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd of customers and security guards. "I've been documenting your behavior for the past hour as part of a comprehensive evaluation of your management practices and adherence to corporate anti-discrimination policies." The transformation in Derek's face was instantaneous and devastating. His aggressive confidence crumbled into horrified recognition as he processed what my revelation meant. The woman he'd spent an hour racially profiling, the mother whose children he'd reduced to tears, the customer he'd threatened with bag searches was actually a corporate evaluator with the authority to end his career. The security guards stepped back in obvious confusion, suddenly unsure whether they should continue following Derek's orders or distance themselves from his actions. "That's impossible," Derek stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're just a customer. I would have been notified if corporate was sending an evaluator." His denial sounded desperate even to his own ears, and I watched him scan my credentials as if hoping they might be forgeries. The hidden camera in my purse had captured every moment of his discriminatory behavior, but now I also had dozens of customers with phone recordings and a store full of witnesses to his treatment of a corporate representative. "Mr. Ashworth," I said, my professional voice replacing the customer persona I'd maintained throughout his harassment. "Mystery shopper evaluations are conducted without advance notice specifically to observe authentic management behavior. You've provided me with extensive documentation of policy violations, discriminatory treatment of customers, and hostile work environment creation." I opened my evaluation portfolio to show him the detailed notes I'd been taking, each timestamp corresponding to specific instances of his misconduct. Sarah Chen approached our group with obvious relief, her earlier attempts to de-escalate the situation now vindicated by the revelation of Derek's catastrophic mistake. "Mr. Ashworth," she said quietly, "I tried to suggest that this approach wasn't appropriate." Her diplomatic reminder that she'd attempted to prevent this disaster carried an undertone of professional self-preservation, and I made a mental note to include her appropriate customer service behavior in my positive recommendations section. The crowd of customers erupted in a mixture of gasps, exclamations, and what sounded like applause from the elderly woman who had defended us earlier. "I knew something was wrong with how you were treating this family," she announced loudly. "And now we know why you felt so comfortable being discriminatory. You thought you could get away with it." Her vindication seemed to speak for all the witnesses who had recognized Derek's behavior as obviously problematic. Kai looked up at me with confusion and growing understanding. "Mommy, you're this man's boss?" he asked, his 8-year-old mind trying to process the reversal of power dynamics he'd witnessed. "Does that mean he has to apologize for being mean to us?" His innocent question cut to the heart of what accountability looked like from a child's perspective, and I saw Derek flinch at the directness of the observation. "Not exactly his boss," I explained gently, "but I work for the company that helps his bosses understand how well he does his job. And today, he did his job very poorly. My explanation was designed to help Kai understand justice without encouraging vindictiveness. Though watching Derek's career implode in real time provided a satisfaction that years of experiencing retail discrimination had made inevitable. Derek's attempts at damage control were painful to witness. "Ms. Williams, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he began, his voice taking on the pleading tone of someone who realized their livelihood was disappearing. "I was just following standard security procedures. If I seemed overly cautious, it was only because we take customer safety very seriously." His attempt to reframe racial profiling as diligent security work sounded absurd given the hour of documented evidence to the contrary. "Mr. Ashworth," I replied with the clinical detachment that professional evaluations required, "I have comprehensive documentation of your behavior, including verbal exchanges captured by hidden camera, witness statements from multiple customers, and timestamps for each policy violation. Your treatment of my family wasn't security consciousness. It was textbook racial discrimination that created a hostile environment for customers of color." Marcus Rivera, the security guard who had seemed uncomfortable throughout Derek's escalation, stepped forward with obvious relief. "Ma'am, I want you to know that I was following orders, but I wasn't comfortable with how this situation developed," he said, his voice carrying the careful diplomacy of someone who needed to protect his own employment while distancing himself from Derek's actions. "This isn't how we usually handle customer interactions." "I understand, Marcus," I replied, consulting my notes about his reluctant participation. "My evaluation will distinguish between employees who initiated discriminatory behavior and those who were pressured to participate by management directives." His visible relief suggested that he'd been worried about his own job security, and I realized Derek's actions had created liability concerns for multiple employees beyond himself. My phone buzzed with a call from my retail watch supervisor, probably responding to my earlier text about exceptional documentation. I declined the call temporarily, knowing that the conversation would require more time and privacy than the current situation allowed. The preliminary findings I'd mentioned in my text message had been an understatement. Derek had provided enough evidence of discriminatory behavior to justify immediate termination and potentially legal action. "I need to speak with your district manager immediately," Derek said, his voice carrying the desperate authority of someone trying to find a higher power who might override the consequences of his actions. "There are protocols for handling corporate evaluations that weren't followed here. I should have been notified that an evaluation was in progress." His attempt to shift blame to procedural failures rather than accepting responsibility for discriminatory behavior was typical of managers facing accountability for misconduct. "Mr. Ashworth," I said, pulling out my business card and evaluation summary form. "The protocols were followed exactly as designed. Mystery shopper evaluations are conducted without advance notice to prevent performance modification that would compromise authentic observations. Your behavior over the past hour represents your actual management practices when you believe no one is monitoring your adherence to corporate policies." The gathering of customers had grown larger as word spread throughout the store about the dramatic revelation, and I could see people pointing phones in our direction as they recorded Derek's humiliation. His discriminatory behavior was becoming viral social media content that would reach audiences far beyond Retail Watch's corporate executives, creating public relations consequences that extended beyond individual employment decisions. Sage had stopped crying and was looking between Derek and me with the kind of intense focus that children bring to trying to understand major reversals in adult power dynamics. "Is the mean man going to lose his job?" she asked with the directness that only 6-year-olds can manage. Her question was probably being recorded by multiple phones, and I realized my answer would become part of the public record of this incident. "That will be decided by his supervisors," I told her gently. "But people who are mean to customers usually don't get to keep jobs where they're supposed to help customers." Derek's visible flinch at my explanation suggested he was beginning to accept the inevitability of serious consequences for his actions, and I felt a satisfaction that years of experiencing retail discrimination had made inevitable. As I packed my evaluation materials and prepared to leave with my children, Derek made one final attempt at damage control. "Ms. Williams, perhaps we could discuss the situation privately," he said, his voice carrying the desperate tone of someone hoping for mercy that his own behavior hadn't earned. "I'm sure we can find a way to resolve any misunderstandings about today's interactions." "There are no misunderstandings to resolve," I replied firmly. "There are only policy violations to document and consequences to implement. My evaluation will be submitted to corporate tomorrow morning, along with video evidence and witness statements from today's interactions." Derek's face went pale as he processed the comprehensive nature of the evidence against him, and I realized he was finally understanding the magnitude of his career-ending mistake. 3 weeks later, I received confirmation that Derek Ashworth had been terminated for gross violations of customer service policies and discriminatory treatment of customers. The Westfield Premium Department Store implemented mandatory bias training for all employees and established new oversight protocols for customer interactions. My evaluation had triggered policy changes that would protect other families from experiencing the discrimination we endured that day. But perhaps, most importantly, Kai and Sage had witnessed something powerful about justice and accountability. They learned that people who abuse their authority eventually face consequences, and that their mother's work involved protecting other families from the kind of treatment we'd experienced. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the most meaningful, teaching us lessons about strength, justice, and the importance of fighting discrimination wherever we encounter it.